Hey everyone, how are you guys doing? All right, great to be here. So pretty excited to talk about interoperability, and it looks like everyone is excited to talk about it and hear what it's about. Woo! All right, quickly, my name is Sergey. I work on the Axelar network, which is also an interoperability network, so pretty knowledgeable about the topic. And today we have a panel of amazing guests, so pretty excited to chat. Let's do a quick round of intros, so maybe 2 seconds each. Maybe grab another mic. Or...
Hey everyone. There we go. Hey everyone, I'm Michael Kaplan. I'm the lead on the Avalanche Bridge team at Ava Labs. We develop and maintain the Avalanche Bridge.
Bryan Pellegrino, co-founder, CEO of LayerZero.
Billy Rennekamp. I'm the Cosmos Hub product lead at the Interchain Foundation.
All right, awesome. So I guess let's start easy. I have one question, and you have to give me one number as the answer. How about that? Billy, starting with you. How many chains?
Hundreds of thousands, if not millions.
Bryan.
Many.
That's not a number.
A big number. I don't know if I can say millions. Tens of thousands to tens of thousands is probably more.
All right.
Magnitude.
How many chains is the question? I'd say double digits.
Double digits. Okay, now let's go into that. All right, why double digits?
Assuming we're talking like how many chains do we see having a long-term beneficial impact and sustained user base.
Yeah.
I think that there are certainly we need many to meet the demand of the blockchain space today. But I think we will see a certain few develop more maturely and have better product offerings and user experience, frankly, than the rest. And I think that if we got into a space where there's hundreds of thousands of chains, many of them would end up being centralized chains anyway. Where if you want to count that, that's great, totally valid. Like we can run blockchains on laptops, but I don't think there would be more than 100 chains that have significant traction in the long run.
All right. Do you guys have any response to that? Let's do that.
No real rebuttal. I mean, I guess you're treating Avalanche as one chain and all the subnets as not their own chains? Or do you believe that there will only be 10 chains on Avalanche and nothing else will exist? Which is you can take that stance if you want.
No, certainly in my definition, I would not count a subnet as its own chain. I was thinking more so L1s.
What about Cosmos chains, right? There's quite a lot already.
Yeah, no, certainly like within subnets or within Cosmos, I think there can be multiple chains.
But Cosmos is like one chain, or how do you define?
No, but in terms of how I was answering my question, I was thinking more so of just L1s. And I think Cosmos as a whole, and I think of Avalanche as a whole as a single L1 solution.
Okay, as a solution. Okay. So Billy?
So I like to think that the definition and the boundary of what a blockchain is not really finished being defined yet. And if you look today, we already are in the hundreds or the thousands. I think that if you're looking at sort of massive protocols, maybe in the tens of thousands, but I would like to sort of see a future where things like WordPresses are the equivalent of a blockchain. Yes, a single laptop, that the sort of like boundary between what a computer is has a similar sort of evolution. You have a computer in everybody's pocket, that there's sort of this blurring of what it means to be a distributed state machine that has access to value networks. IBC is sort of the go-to, but the boundary of what can be a blockchain really changes when you start zooming out, and I think that we're going to see an evolution of that.
So it seems like, Billy, do you think of blockchains as like a database in some sense, or a network, right, where any application can run? And I think that's sort of analogous to like a Cosmos ecosystem, right, or the vision. And so everybody kind of deserves their own database namespace in some sense, right? And everybody can do things. And I think, Michael, what you're talking about more about like ecosystems in general, right? And you're saying like a blockchain is sort of a platform, and so I only will expect to see kind of a couple dozen. Is that kind of fair? comparison?
Yeah, I like to think of blockchains as sort of like an evolution in the paradigm of programming, and it's a type of software that has scarcity built in. It can have an accounting system that actually keeps track of scarcity in a way that is beneficial to a lot of applications that hasn't been possible before. Had to have disintermediation or third parties to sort of enforce representation of scarcity, but it has sort of scarcity baked in, and that is a real paradigm shift for what types of applications can exist, and all of those applications will need different architectures, they'll have different needs, and they'll make sense in different protocols.
Awesome. So I guess moving on then with those kind of numbers in mind, let's talk about interoperability, right? And I think let's start simple. Why do you think interoperability, is an important topic to be thinking about it? Why are we spending so much time talking about it? And what's your take on it?
I've been talking a lot. Somebody want to take this one first?
For me, I think it's the simple constraints of the system. I think we're just hitting upper limits of what a single chain can do, and we're hitting limits on what each application can do within certain chains. Applications have different needs. I think everything that's going to come around with scaling that, it's a natural evolution in the same way we've done it with many other pieces of technology prior. So I think it was always going to be the case, and I think it's just kind of like the standard path for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree there. I think there's certainly more demand than a single chain could meet. So making sure that people are able to easily and freely move between chains to kind of meet that demand as a whole in the blockchain space is important. And also different chains might have different product offerings that might incentivize people or drive people to move between them. And interoperability is very important to consider when thinking about that. If you want liquidity to flow into your system, or you want to really drive people to enter it from chains that are outside of your own.
So,
I don't know if we have any country music fans, but there's a Roger Miller song, "It Takes All Kinds to Make a World." And I think that if we're going to see this sort of diversity of applications that need to exist, we're going to have really a need for interoperability standards for all of them to work well together.
Awesome. So just to, I guess, summarize that, so it seems like there's two sort of core themes right there. There's one, many chains in interoperability as a solution to scaling, right? I think that's what sort of Bryan started with, and so we need more chains in order to continue scaling. Second one is just diversity of use cases and diversity of needs, right? And so across all of them, we're going to need interoperability just the same way. Awesome. So I guess moving on, let's talk about security a little bit. And I think it's an important topic given all of the attacks we've seen in the space. In some sense, I guess it's early for the interoperability ecosystem, right? It's only been, I guess, a couple of years since some of the first protocols started to go live with IBC and so on and so forth. And so from one perspective, it is no different than in the early days of DeFi, right? Where people were building, a lot of stuff was kind of shipped without audits, right, or anything like that, and people found vulnerabilities, and people lost money. Some people forked, right, to mitigate it. So I guess, curious, how do you think about security? Where should the security come from? And more importantly, how do you think about trade-offs between liveness and safety for interoperability protocols?
Yeah, I mean, we generally go for safety over liveness and Tendermint as a protocol, et cetera. But I think a real core tenet of Cosmos ecosystem is sovereignty and interoperability, and sovereignty being sort of you're in control of your own security. And this is a paradigm which works for a large category of applications. And the benefits of it are basically to fault tolerate cascading failures. If you're all using the same security, everything will fail from the beginning. So which is why at the beginning we've especially pushed forward this ability to have sovereign secure networks where you're up to yourself, it's up to your blockchain to sort of do it your way. Building from that, we see that there's obviously need and value from shared security. When you band together, you get benefits. You take away certain things. You stop having complete control of your aspect of it. But again, it takes all kinds. Some networks need this, some networks don't. And so we're beginning to sort of offer different variations of shared security to sort of pool security across networks because we think, again, there's going to be a variety of needs there.
Yeah, I really strongly agree in the parameterization of security at the application layer. I think something that I've sort of fundamentally disagreed with most other approaches prior is that everything lives at the protocol layer. The kind of example I give all the time is that it doesn't really make sense that there's a world that somebody verifying on chain B that they own a copper sword in a game on chain A, and somebody transferring $500 million are opting into the exact same set of hyperparameters for security. Either somebody's wildly overpaying or somebody's not getting nearly enough security. For us, I think it's fundamentally always been move all of that up the stack. So like Billy was saying, applications can sort of control their own, whether they're running a piece of a relayer, what that looks like, how distributed that looks like. Applications have the ability to sort of take control of a piece of the security stack as well as the parameterization, whether that's block comps, whether that's all of it. And so I think for me, that's one thing that I think is just hugely important and being sort of unaddressed right now is how security is handled, because I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all security solution currently for every application, especially when you move beyond just for value transfer, there's like a one-size-fits-most, but once you move beyond it to generic messaging and like kind of a broader array of things applications can do, I think it gets a lot trickier, and I think it's kind of broadly unaddressed right now.
Yeah, so I guess just on that a little bit, to go a little bit deeper, right? I think one, I guess, concern, right, with moving the security choices to the application is that the application, like developer, has to make a lot of potentially choices for themselves, and right? And so like I've been designing like crypto protocols for a while and like cryptography standards, and so most of the time when you give people parameters or developers parameters, they mess up, right? So and I guess like curious, right, kind of from both of you, Bill and Bryan, like how do you think about it? And developers are not used to think security-wise, okay? They want to be given, HTTPS as a protocol and just run with it, right? With as few parameters as possible. And so if we're pushing security to the applications, like, doesn't that complicate things for them?
So I think it's more of a option of can versus must, right? So every application can do that, but they don't have to. There's clearly a default set of parameterization. Most applications, it's basically the ability for an application to externalize, to price that risk and externalize it to some set of external hyperparameters, or to internalize the risk and own a piece. Like Billy was saying, whether you own your own security, whether you run your own infrastructure stack. The whole point is that, yes, there will be a lot of applications will go with sort of whatever is existing and sort of defaults or easy to use and sort of leverage sort of industrial grade things. Other networks who are doing this as a service, basically take any modern network and put it as a component, and everybody can opt into that. But it's the ability for everybody to optionally run their own or optionally cross-reference. Maybe you're totally content with some existing distributed network that performs consensus and says like passes this piece, but you just add a single piece that cross-references and that's it. Your piece has no full control. You're reliant on that, but you basically, even in the failure state of that, you always have your own cross-reference. So I think it's really just, again, trade-offs on necessity at the application layer. I do think the very large majority will just opt into defaults, but I think giving the lever versus not giving the lever matters a lot.
I think I begin by saying, which I say to a lot of applications developers, is don't be afraid of taking on that task, because it's actually a really rich design space, and there's a lot of mileage you can get out of incorporating that, doing it well, and doing it right from the beginning, and really thinking deeply on it. Of course, everybody has priorities, nobody has enough time, and so you might start picking and choosing your battles, and I think that's when you can take some of the defaults that I'd like to think are sort of hardened over many networks, sort of coming to agreement and testing things over and over, while ultimately maintaining the ability to modify it going forward, and even potentially specializing. We're spending a lot of time on interchain security right now, and that basically separates a staking token, Cosmos Hub, pro validators, infrastructure operators, node operators, from a governance token, which is meant to rule how the application itself is parameterized. And I think that a specialization between those two skill sets can go a long way as well.
Yeah, the only thing I would have to add there, well, not only thing, but the one thing I would add there is that I think it's also important to present what security assumptions have been made as simply as possible to the end user. Because one thing that I've noticed as we get into the interoperability space with non-technical people is that they kind of just assume that it works if it does work. And once you get to crossing multiple bridges, you can really start enveloping the security model of one into another, and all of a sudden you're left with the weakest link being the kind of pain point that you might not even realize is the security issue for your DeFi position. on chain whatever after jumping multiple chains. So yeah, I think it's very important to be as direct and upfront about the security models of these different bridges because, like you said, they all have different ones.
Awesome. So I guess I want to go deeper in one of the points you mentioned. So if we live, in a world with hundreds of thousands or, double digits or millions of chains, how do you think connectivity is going to look like, right? And I think the common models is like pairwise connectivity, right? Like hub and spoke connectivity, right? Maybe hybrid connectivity across them. So yeah, curious, how you think about topology of the blockchains and how it's going to look like. And I think double down on that, if you look at the internet today, right? Like every time, I send a packet, it kind of goes through like 10 to 20 hops on average, right? So do you expect with millions of chains out there that every time you send a transaction to a destination, it's going to go through 10 hops along the way, right? And as a result, you're going to accumulate all the security assumptions and risks in the line of code built in the process, or how do you think about it?
Yeah, I think when I think of this question, I'm mostly thinking about subnets, and I think that there will be an organic ecosystem that kind of is developed where some subnets are only connected to the other subnets that they need to be interoperable with, because it's totally possible for there to be some gaming subnet that really doesn't need to rely on any other subnet, and it isn't interoperable, and that's totally fine. But the ones that do need to be interoperable will be kind of overlapping in their validator sets, and we can kind of build from there.
But how do they connect to each other, pairwise, or are they going to talk through like your main C chain or something?
Yeah, so if you want to validate a subnet, you need to validate the primary network, which consists of the X, C, and P chain. So there is some overlap in that validation, and we could leverage those chains and communication through those chains to have information flow across the subnets.
So topologies through the similar validators?
Yeah, overlapping validator sets.
Okay.
Because say you have subnet A and subnet B, that all of those validators are all of the validators in subnet A are also validating the C chain, and all of the validators in subnet B are also validating those three chains. So they can all see that information. And with that kind of natural overlap, I think we'll see a organic interoperability between subnets develop. That's what I hope anyway. Obviously, we're not quite there yet.
Yeah, I have a reasonably strong conviction that it will largely be end-to-end. I guess I could see some hops develop where people just opt into only having connections with certain pathways, and therefore you have to go hops. But I would say I have a very strong conviction that it won't be hub and spoke, because I don't think there's any viable security model right now that can deal with a hub and spoke model, even at the simple models that are right now, which are primarily just bonded networks. You're talking these really adversarial properties where you secure, X of $5 billion, and like Uniswap opts in and now it's 20, and Aave opts in and now it's 50, and if the bond in the network is not growing like non-linearly to the value that's being secured, it's adversarial incentives for like every prior application that was within that before. And I think just generally we've seen that it's both not capital efficient to bond at a reasonable value, and it just has never ever happened in any network to date, maybe one. So yeah, I just think the honeypot's going to get too big at some point, and that any sort of hub and spoke model is sort of destined to grow so big that it must fail for the most part. So I would say end-to-end is much more likely.
Disagree. I do think a hub and spoke model is an eventual outcome. The timeline when we see that, I think, is a little bit unclear. I think end-to-end is still a better user experience. It has better guarantees. I think that at a certain point, it's going to be the infrastructure operators who really push for that. Massively simplifies the life of relayers or these different people who are performing or helping perform interoperability transactions to have a hub and spoke model where they're able to just sort of center on a few different routes and do that. Same way we saw with airlines At one point, yes, you could fly anywhere in the world. I mean, you still technically can, but you don't need to have an airline that runs between every single city. It just stops being efficient for the airlines themselves. So they start building in routes. It's the airline industry that's doing this. It's not the users who are asking for it necessarily. You bring up a good point about the sort of security considerations there, and I do think that we'll see eventually a much more complicated sort of mesh net of security guarantees across networks, where it's not just a single validator set of a single hub that's going to be really, a critical point of failure, but you can actually start distributing similar to the overlap in subnets. It's a really beautiful design that you have sort of overlap so that you're never sort of securely or singularly dependent on a single group, and similar to LayerZero, the way that you're not singularly dependent on the oracles or the relayers themselves.
And I guess if we look at sort of, even how the internet shaped up, right? It's not all peer-to-peer connectivity, right? Like we have peer-to-peer connections, but they're delivered across sometimes peer-to-peer channels, sometimes hubs, right? Like, you have Cloudflare, for instance, right? That sort of caches information everywhere and helps you prevent against like security reasons, right? And so I guess the big difference that I like to think about when comparing like internet topology with the blockchain topology is that the more hops you take on the internet, you're still fine in some sense, right? Because internet only provides us with liveness guarantees, right? You deliver a packet yes or no, all the security comes, from protocols on top of it, right? Whereas in the blockchain space, whenever we're talking about multiple hops, and if everything is just completely peer-to-peer, then unless a network can make hundreds of thousands of connections on its own, it's going to have to go through some intermediary connector anyways, right? And so you're going to be assuming security assumptions of that, right? And so I guess curious if you have any thoughts in terms of the more peer-to-peer there is, right, the more security assumptions we never have to take. Otherwise, we're going to be, in a topology of n-square connections that nobody can manage in some sense.
And another way that manifests in a kind of terrible user experience today is that assets that go through these different routes, they are dependent on that route, and they're really non-fungible with assets that came through other routes because, they're dependent on being able to come back through that original route. But I'm really excited about the IBC team. Interchain has been working on updates to the way multi-hop and what they call sort of a heartbeat protocol works, where you're able to have a point-to-point connection, and that channel can basically be represented via a secondary route. So a packet which is sort of destined from A to B can go through C to B, but from B's perspective, it seems like it came directly from A in order to preserve that sort of singular route, as long as A has light client proofs to B, A has it to C, and C has it to B. We're able to sort of like relay those guarantees as if it came directly through, which is going to drastically sort of simplify the user experience and the routing aspects of it.
But you're still paying 2 transaction costs, right, to do that?
Yeah, I mean, the economics of relaying is a whole nother sort of can of worms that I'm pretty excited about some of the solutions for, but definitely would be still a more complicated route, 2 transactions, although, again, from the perspective of chain B, it seems like it came directly.
Twice the cost roughly, but you're getting the experience as if it came. So it really depends on obviously the more hops there, it can become some sort of throughput bottleneck where transactions are just getting too expensive if you need to go multiple hops. Obviously right now, from your frame, it doesn't really matter that much because all of Tendermint is pretty reasonably efficient and cheap, right? So it's great when you live in that ecosystem. But I think when you think about wrapping in and folding in other ecosystems, it can potentially become pretty burdensome.
The original connection is still viable, so you could always relay it yourself, piecemeal with 1 transaction. But if you're going to rely on third parties sort of doing it, then you could go through the double route and pay twice as much to not have to do it yourself.
It's kind of back to the point of pushing more options to the application, right, to kind of choose and configure some of these routes, right? Awesome. So I know we have a couple of minutes left, but I guess another important question is, what do you think the role of insurance is going to be, right, in the interoperability? And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on it. I know DeFi originally didn't have any insurance. Now we're starting to see some insurance protocols pop up. Is that something we're going to see in the interoperability stacks as well?
I don't have any super strong opinions or well-formed opinions here, I think. I think ideally it wouldn't be needed if everything worked as expected, obviously.
It's software.
Yeah. But I mean, obviously you're going to have those types of issues, and I think when I think of how I want to spend my energy, I want to spend it trying to eliminate those critical failure conditions rather than trying to mitigate what would happen if they do occur.
But what if they will?
And they absolutely will. I think I just personally would rather focus my energy on preventing that from occurring rather than mitigating the disaster if they do occur. But obviously those types of situations have and will continue to occur. And obviously insurance is one way to protect against that. But outside of that, I don't have super strong opinions.
I mean, I think all of us here want to spend as much time as possible like hardening the design and the protocol. It's just like you're reducing the space of the tail, but like the tail is still completely catastrophic if you haven't like addressed it or mitigated it in any sense. Yeah, from my perspective, again, I think about it from the way like the way that we design is that most of the risk is held in these sort of, I call them shards of just whether it's the Oracle and Relayer, but like the application owning one piece and some industrial set owning another piece. And so the whole point is sort of, if you have this one party, whoever it is that a lot of nodes use, normally if that party breaks, you can win like a very large aggregation of something. And in this case, you actually shard it where it breaks and, only one application or certain applications have colluded. So it's actually like, orders of magnitude more expensive to attack the core system because you're only winning 1/30th or 1/300th of like total risk that you would win if it just independently controlled everything. So I think part of it is creating an economic model that shards or silos risk as much as possible, giving applications the ability to sort of have sovereignty of their own security whenever they want, and then obviously creating incentives, whether it be insurance funds or whatever else, to create those sort of commoditized industrial nodes that lots of people are using, and what that economic model looks like, and what people are, how they're pricing, externalizing that risk, right? And I think that's what really matters.
When I think of insurance, I kind of think of two categories. And one is this sort of shared security mesh net of insurance between protocols, where you basically pay a fee to another network to borrow some of the risk of their validator set, and that's like paying insurance against your own validator set. And then the other one is like a little bit closer to the DeFi insurance that we've seen, which is maybe more user targeted or something, which is kind of like poor man's way of getting guarantees because you weren't able to do the full perfect technical solution. And I love to see that. And I love to see the different bridge architectures, people on this stage, Avalanche as well, obviously Axelar, because I feel like they're sort of approaching the same problem that Cosmos has been approaching, but from different directions. Cosmos very early on sort of went super into the future. I'm like, cool, this is going to be a problem. Let's solve it like perfectly, the best guarantee sort of system from a technical level. But we're also needing to solve it from the here and now perspective, which is, yes, we have these expensive EVM chains. We need LayerZero to have like a very sort of clever way to have as much of IBC as we can without having to like do a full light client verification on an EVM. We have Axelar with these bridges. We have all this sort of architecture inside of Avalanche for these bridges. And I feel like we're sort of meeting in the middle from these two different timelines. Like Cosmos is moving backwards and you all are moving forward and bridging. And that insurance is another sort of tool in that kit of making it the here and the now work well enough to actually onboard the sort of users that we'd like to get to with a world where like, hey, maybe it's not as necessary to have these bespoke bridge solutions or insurance because we have the perfect technical solution. So I think it's important to be working on both of them at the same time and trying to find the sort of middle ground that we'll all be able to meet up at.
Awesome. Well, I think we're pretty much out of time, so want to thank you all. Thanks, guys, for your time. I think this was super interesting. Thank you all
very much.
And thank you, Sergey. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together.